Thank you. It's a great pleasure being here, and in part because I have a huge amount of admiration for independent organizations that promote architecture. And so I think that the Dallas Architectural Forum is in some ways too rare, and the fact that you exist and exist vibrantly is fantastic. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And what I'm going to do is present a series of projects of our office, and to use the Manual of Section, the book that we recently published, as a kind of organizing tool to kind of lay out our work. But the manual itself was our way of getting at what we think is one of the kind of fundamental aspects of architecture, which is the nature of a section, the vertical cut through a building. And we've often used section as a generative tool in our design. It's kind of instrumental in the way in which we think about projects. We think sections are incredibly important in terms of how one can both work at a very abstract level, but also work in a very specific level, work at a kind of social structure, hierarchy between upper floors and lower floors, deal with material questions and so forth. But one of the fascinating things about sections in architecture is they're often relegated to a kind of third position. Plan is dominant. It's the kind of key thing that organizes the building. Then the facade is the way in which the building presents itself to the public, and the section's kind of the utilitarian, third child. It's there to support the facade. It's there to help negotiate relationships between the plan and the facade, but it's essentially a kind of technical tool, or at least that's often the way it's presented. And that's, in a sense, unfortunate. Now, one of the other things that's interesting about section is that as a technique for getting at what you can't see, a section is extraordinary. It actually reveals things that are not visible but are fundamental to how buildings go together, how thermal force operates, how structural questions operate. It's instrumental in the way in which we think about how buildings operate. And for us, section is not something that should be a kind of just purely a technical tool. The history of the drawing type actually came out as a result of being a cut after the fact. So one of the problems of section is that the history of the drawing type came not as a generative tool, but actually as a reactive tool. It came as a way to kind of understand existing bodies, whether it was Leonardo da Vinci's use of a cut through a skull or drawings of monuments of antiquity. The section was a tool that occurred after the design had already existed, or the building or the body had already existed. And so it's not surprising that often section now is used after the design is materialized, often in a three-dimensional drawing software, and the cut then occurs as a way of understanding what you've designed. And we kind of want to challenge that. We would argue that, in fact, the way in which one uses section needs to be instrumental in thinking about how design itself operates. Now, for the book, we combine sections with perspectives, and section perspective has a long history, and one of the fascinating things about the section perspective is that it combines two drawing types. It combines the section, which I mentioned is this abstract cut that reveals what you can't see. So here you see the way in which it shows you what's in the thickness of the wall. And then the perspective, which perfectly aligns with the section, gives you a sense of what it's like to be in a space. So you get both the abstract cut and the embodied sensibility simultaneous in its drawing technique. So it's a great drawing technique, and it was a point of departure for a way in which we often design, but it's also how we thought about the book. So the argument that we put forward in the book was that there are 7 distinctly different ways that architects produce effects in section, effects in the vertical axis of a building, in the vertical dimension of a building. And these 7 different types are not in and of themselves a kind of value. In other words, we wouldn't regard a building that only has one of these types as therefore being a success because it only exhibits one of these types, but rather it's actually in the logic of the hybrid, where architects have combined these section types in different ways that one gets the most interesting approach. But as a didactic tool, the book was trying to unpack the typology of how have architects used section in different ways. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I'll use these section types to then unfold a series of our own projects. So to do the book, we did drawings of 63 existing buildings, and they had to be existing buildings because we wanted to get the working drawings of those buildings to be able to then do these detailed cross-section perspectives of the projects. So let me just jump right in. Extrusion is our first section type. And if you've ever existed in an architecture studio or had a design project critiqued for not having a great section, it's probably because it just had an extruded section. That means that you're basically lifting the ceiling up a certain height necessary for a program above the floor, and that's it. It's not very interesting, usually. So there are moments where it can be fascinating. So in Philip Johnson's glass house, it's a perfect extrusion, and it puts a huge amount of pressure on the glass, and the relationship through the glass, the reflections, the connections to the outside, which are intensified by the clarity of that extrusion, become really important. Other architects have taken that displacement of space and said, well, what happens if we actually go beyond the height that's conventional but get into a kind of an extreme height? So Nervi's Palace of Labor now lifted the ceiling and extruded section up to 82 feet high, and it produced this fantastic space of spectacle because of the kind of excess of that ceiling height. So the first project I'll present is an extruded section, and oddly, actually not so oddly, most of the design was then played out in plan, right? So the development of the project on this particular site was to kind of configure about 20 classrooms for very young children, age 6 weeks to about 5 years, about 220 kids distributed into these classrooms. We knew that we couldn't have steps, we couldn't have any variation within the floor due to tripping hazards, so it was going to be a single-story building. So a lot of the emphasis then became, how do we work within this logic and produce a building that can actually introduce section qualities within this extruded limit? So one of the initial questions was saying, can we actually make the rooms have a room within a room? Can it be set up so that when you come down the hallway, there's a sense that you're entering into a house, and then that house frames a kind of room within the larger scale space, and then that would link out to the image of a house in the courtyards. So here, the kind of cross-section view, the image of that space. And so the doors are all marked by a kind of house articulated in a particular wood that then links directly to a felt-lined, more acoustically tempered area, room for kind of more quiet gathering. And then that links directly out to an outside space that is framed in cedar. You can see it outside there. And this, for us, was one of the best parts about the project, this interstitial space that allowed kids to go outside while still being effectively within the limits of the screen, within the control for the teachers. And then these classrooms all gather into age-appropriate play spaces that connect between all of the 6 or 7 classrooms of the same age group. So effectively, we would get 3 different playscapes that would be linked to the younger kids, the middle-aged kids, and the older kids. And these would then be marked by a series of fence posts. We knew that we'd have to have fences enclosing the playscapes. What happens if those fences weren't just the conventional 6-foot height, but actually went the entire height of the building and became a series of markers that would kind of register around the site? And more importantly, as they would work to the front of the building, they would start to become battens on the building, but then start to kind of come out, in a sense, be almost as if they were people anticipating the gathering in front of the building that would then hold signs and lighting and kind of mark the entry of the building, animating the space at the front of the project. The plan was a centralized plan, and one of the things for us that was really important is that we found a way we would have a centralized plan with no single center. So if you look at the geometry, all of the curves, all the hallways don't lead to a single point of control. There's a general sense of organization, but even when one's in looking down a hallway, you can't quite see what's down the next hallway, so there's always this kind of sense of discovery, but there's still a logic of organization for the standpoint of the way in which the school was run. The gross motor rooms, which are gathered into this collective space, allow for much larger gatherings, and one of the details we really liked was taking the simple drywall that would line the hallways and bringing it out into the space, billowing that drywall, which we know is 5/8 of an inch thick, but acquiring a kind of thickness, almost a kind of play or a delight within this gathering space at the heart of the building. Okay, other extruded sections that we developed were a series of restaurants we did in New York. And these, we knew the space was a given. We would have to figure out invention within this kind of preset ceiling height. So a lot of our work was trying to figure out how we would develop an efficient plan and develop a seductive surface on the walls and the ceilings of the project. So for Fluff Bakery, the plan was to work with about 3 miles of 3/4-inch industrial felt and stained plywood strips. And these would then be aggregated up the wall into the ceiling. They would play the role of the back of the seat. They would have acoustic properties. They would transition from dark to light. And so they'd kind of produce a sense of velocity in perspective, but in elevation, they would flatten the relationship between the wall and the ceiling. So the speaker is the joint between the wall and the ceiling in the project. And then from the street, they would have the ability to almost operate as a kind of signage. They would seduce people to come in. It worked for a while. The food wasn't very good, and the place closed in about 12 months. But we were still very proud of this idea of working within this limited height to introduce qualities of section within the extruded limits. Another, probably the smallest project we ever built was a hot dog stand. And the plan here was to have the movement down the sidewalk come into the hot dog stand. The customers would look at the hot dog, pick it, eat it on the counter, and leave. And the client imagined they would just get a continuous line of people moving through the project. We argued somewhat counterintuitively that given the limits of the ceiling height, we're actually going to lower the ceiling and raise the floor, and that's going to produce the effect of a forced perspective. So that you would go from something that would look like this to something that would have this kind of a quality. And we convinced the client of this by saying that the forced perspective would give the illusion that their hot dog that they were selling was actually bigger. And from a detail standpoint, and this is also kind of way in which we're thinking about the consequence of design, the metal or the steel bar stock was about 6 inches wide at the front of the space and became 2 inches wide back here. Every other strip was gapped, so there was a dotted line dividing between kind of anticipation and consumption. And the only thing that was flat in the entire space because of the slope floor and the ceiling was the counter, which meant that it didn't matter how tall you were, you could find a comfortable place to eat your hot dog on the counter. Okay, so stack is the second model of section, and it really is basically taking an extruded section and placing it on top of itself. Again, not terribly complicated, and it's probably how most buildings are produced. Most buildings that take an FAR and then replicate it. But there are ways that architects have found interest within the stack section. One of them is to simply say your floors don't have to be self-similar. You could have the Crown Hall grand space that Mies designed for the architecture school, and that's made possible because of the much smaller service-oriented lower kind of basement area, which then absorbs all the bathrooms and support facilities that make possible the floor up above. Another example would be Lino Bobardi's museum, where that stack section is then displaced above the public plaza, and the sidewalk is able to bleed in across the roof of the project. And so you get this fantastic stack section that's displaced above. And then there's also really interesting different ways in which the stack section is related to these very large structural beams. And then the way in which the basement, again, is providing the support facilities to make the more monumental stack section be able to be put on display. Another ways that architects have done this is they said, all right, not only can we make maybe 2 or 3 floors different, but what happens when we make every floor of a building totally unique? And so this is the Downtown Athletic Club that Rem Koolhaas writes about in Delirious, New York, where every single floor which is mapped to a particular program has its own ceiling height, its own program, its own atmosphere, its own lighting condition. So you get the squash floor, or the locker room floor, or the mini golf floor, or the boxing floor, et cetera. So that's a way in which you get these kind of variations. I happen to live in an apartment right here because the whole thing post 9/11 was converted into cookie cutter apartments. It's a long story, but we've lived there for a while. What's interesting is that the conversion of this very unique sequence of sections into conventional condos has led to all kinds of weird problems. Not the least of which is that one apartment, it's a duplex apartment, you go into the upper level, nice floor, you go down to your bedroom level, no windows. So, because you realize you're probably in the swimming room floor. So all of these kind of weird anomalies of the incompatibility between this and conventional residential units. So a more extreme version is MVRDV's Hanover Pavilion, where every single floor is not only a different floor height, but different atmosphere, different environment, different structural system, because they were trying to take the different landscapes of Holland and play them out in a kind of big, kind of a sandwich, a Big Mac being played out within the section of the building. Okay, so this idea of trying to invent within the stack section is something we worked on in a project called New Suburbanism. And the argument here was to take the horizontal expanse of the big box store and essentially take McMansions and place them on top of the roof of the big box store. In a sense, mating or taking the desires of America and playing them out in section and allowing them to kind of coexist. And so this was a conceptual project, and our argument is that you would end up maintaining an autonomy between these two surfaces, meaning there'd be a street over here feeding to the housing, there'd be another street down here feeding to the store. They would coexist, but they would not. You would not pass from one to the other. They would only be revealed again through the section. And we were looking at these kind of satirical efficiencies where a sprinkler pipe below could water the lawn, the heat from the building could keep the lawn green year-round, and the idea that you would go in and buy the lawnmower and then be able to use the lawnmower up above. So I think that thinking through how what would be the consequence played out in specifics, even the idea that the commute around the block would then pass by a parking garage that would be split open so the lights of the cars could illuminate the playing field at night and so forth. So we became very interested in how these ideas, these diagrammatic ideas, get played out in more attentive details. Okay, so to move from a more speculative project to a much more pragmatically driven project, this was a series of research that we had worked on relative to looking at the back bays in the Atlantic coast, and namely looking at neighborhoods that probably shouldn't have been built on wetlands. They're there now, and the question is, what do you do? How do you deal with this problem given the rising sea levels due to global warming? And in particular, we were looking at the back bay of Atlantic City. We know the front line of Atlantic City gets armored by the US Army Corps and provides a kind of buffer against the casinos. It's the back bays that are getting clobbered because they don't have the kind of armored protection. They're the ones that suffer the most in the storms. So the kind of false binary that's put forward is often you're either going to fortify, you're going to put a large wall up, or you're going to retreat. And there's a number of problems with both of these, and we were trying to figure out a way through section that one could actually maintain and invent a kind of different way that this neighborhood could evolve without falling into these two models. In a sense, could we develop an amphibious suburb through the development of section? So a lot of this is predicated on what's already happening, right? The lifting of houses, the displacement in section of these houses, they're being built on those stilts, and often property is sold with the stilts already there, which is itself is kind of a very peculiar way of thinking about it. And there's this proliferation. It's an architectural problem, which is when you lift a building off of its ground, what happens? Where's the front door? Is the public face of the building the underbelly of the building? There's all kinds of interesting problems. We've done analysis, some weird case studies where you get porches that become so big they're almost like lawns. And so this is something that we're working within. And so our question was, could we quite simply accept the fact that houses are going to be elevated, and could we take these neighborhoods that are built on wetlands and allow the wetland to come back in, be able to allow canals to come in and the migration of salt marshes to re-inhabit the suburb, and to, in a sense, develop a different model. This would involve a kind of combination of what could be called gray or harder infrastructure, which is necessary for some of the storm surges, but to try to find a way that where you now have this inundation, which you see from Sandy, but that we would develop evacuation routes that would provide some degree of protection, but that protection wouldn't be hard. It would be porous. It would allow water to come in. It would allow the wetlands to come in into the back alleys, which are excessive, and we can allow canals to start to work their way in through the project. So when there is flooding, it's able to have some level of protection. And then over time, and we really saw this as a 100-year project, that houses would get lifted, there'd be the migration back of the wetlands, and that one would get to a situation where the kind of liquid surfaces of the ground would be part of the logic as opposed to just simply grass. And then when there is flooding, and there will be catastrophic flooding, it's not catastrophic relative to the effects on the neighborhood. Okay, so we got the opportunity following Hurricane Sandy to do a very particular project, which was to rebuild Coney Island Steeplechase Pier. And this had been severely damaged in Hurricane Sandy. The entire surface had been kind of destroyed. And we had to do the CDs on this in about 6 weeks, and it was built about in 6 months after that, and reopened in the summer about 7 or 8 months after the beginning of the project. And for us, it was a kind of fascinating project because it had very limited section. It was just this kind of extruded expanse, which raised other questions. Like, we'd have to figure out a way that it would be at the more local level, that there'd be a lot of work done in the infrastructure of the pier, and that a lot of our work would be played out at the human scale. So benches that would both look out to the water or look to people watching, so you could kind of sit with someone who has a different opinion about what they want to look at, and you can look in opposite directions and still be together. Or a chaise kind of sunbathing, a collective sunbathing surface. And at the center of the pier, a sunshade device that would then cast the name of Coney Island through the shadows onto the surface. And I think my favorite moment is at the end of the pier, where you usually have an incredible number of fishermen. We displaced ever so slightly the surface of the ground so that you could look over the top of the fishermen and then be able to kind of see what's going on, be able to have the view. The fishermen could kind of continue to exist, and you can turn around and look back at Coney Island. So again, a much more subtle play of section within this project, reconstituting an infrastructural piece after the hurricane. Okay. So shape is, the argument about shape and what distinguishes it is that the surfaces, which in the previous section models are essentially horizontal, here one introduces a kind of contour either to the ceiling or the floor of a building. And often this is done for structural reasons, and often it's done for the purposes of gathering people. Kind of how you coordinate groups of people is often done through a shaped section. So a couple of examples, Felix Candelia's very thin concrete structures are clearly using the forces, the lines of force, to map out a geometry in a particular shape, but it also helps organize the restaurant into a series of slightly smaller scale eating areas. So it has both a kind of structural connection, but also a social connection. The way in which Utsen's church, the shaped ceiling is clearly set to kind of bring light in a kind of heavenly way, evoke clouds, but also choreograph the relationship between the preacher and the congregation, right? In a very different way, Ron Champ works with that kind of underbelly to both kind of bring people in, but then also push them back out to all of the various chapels and the landscape around the periphery. One of the fascinating things about drawing detailed cross-sections of buildings is you start to reveal some of the artifice that architects do. So this is often regarded as being the thickest wall in the building, but it's actually constructed of the thinnest amount of material, whereas one of the thinner walls is actually technically thicker in terms of mass. So you get these interesting inversions that take place within the section. So, and another shaped section that starts to reveal the limits of what you can do by contouring all surfaces is Ito's Opera House. And even here you realize that because you can only occupy a very, very small amount of that shaped section as its diagram, basically there and even there, that in order to make this building inhabitable, it has to kind of be intersected with a series of sections. Okay, so for us, we were wanting to find a way that by working in section, by contouring the ground and the ceiling, could we produce a design for a museum? This was a competition. I think there were about 2,000 entries, and we knew that we'd have to have something that was both diagrammatically clear, but also could then be unfolded into the entire very large square footage that was part of the program of the competition. And our argument was to say that rather than starting with this conventional relationship between people, art, and space, that we would start to kind of adjust the floor, adjust the ceiling, and be able to set up a much greater variety of relationships between interior, exterior, between objects and people, between vitrines and ceilings, et cetera. And that then we could start to kind of give a sense of what this might be like in cross-section perspectives, even looking at moments where, say, the display of a vitrine is actually linked to the glass ceiling that would connect to. There'd be interior spaces and exterior spaces all through how they relate to these two surfaces. We didn't win the competition, no surprise there. We're not building a museum in Egypt, but we found a way to use this section idea in an all-you-can-eat buffet in Las Vegas, which is where all good ideas go to be tested out at some level, but they get torqued somehow. So this 600 people buffet, and the argument was that everybody had to come in here and be able to see where the food was, but we didn't want to have the sense that you were eating with 600 other people. Nobody really likes to eat with 600 other people. So to try to find a way we could break the scale down, and to do that by contouring the ceiling, contouring the floor, using the banquettes and the ceiling, the acoustic ceiling, to start to stage these different areas, but to still set up a kind of line of vision that would go through the project. And here you see some of the kind of photographs of how that works. Particularly at the edge, it became quite clear how the project was set up. We spend a lot of time drawing what are called reflected ceiling plans. The ceiling, we actually think, is the site of potentially more design energy than the floor plan, because you can do more things in the ceiling, and frankly, the ceiling has to do more. It has to deal with mechanical systems, lighting, acoustics, et cetera. And then we figured out a ways that we can actually start to really take that on as a site for design. You'll spend more time looking at the ceiling than you will the floor. Why not design the ceiling? So that's become a kind of an obsession within our work. Okay. So another project where the shaping of the ceiling became really crucial was a renovation, a kind of adaptive reuse of a maintenance building in California. It was an existing building, and we were asked to rethink it for an open office space for about 100 employees. It was a maintenance building. It was this is where the plumber shop, the paint shop, et cetera, used to exist. So one of the questions was, how do we work with this prefabricated steel structure and bring a kind of quality of life to it? On the other hand, if we were to build a single-story office building, we probably wouldn't be able to justify a 35-foot high space with almost no columns. So it was a great set of bones to work with, but we had a difficult time because we couldn't run any of the mechanical systems through the ground. We had to run it through the ceiling. So that became a lot of the work, is how do we calibrate all of this stuff? How do we get enough solitubes to bring natural light into the project? And in a sense, designing the sculpture of the ceiling that engages these technical issues became the heart of the project, developing a set of kind of baffles that could be choreographed within the ceiling that would then give a kind of coherence to the volume, tie the whole thing together, but also be a kind of surface that would allow it to adjust during the course of the day. So as the sun would move across it, as it would shift from day to night, you'd have different kind of senses of time within this very large space, which we thought was effective at taking this existing space and giving it a kind of new architectural character through section. The outside of the space, this is the existing building, and our thought was to take the geometries, they're pretty predictable roof lines, and to extend them further, and to develop a kind of cedar shade, kind of screening device that would extend those geometries and kind of thicken the exterior wall to capture places that you could sit, you could gather. It's almost as if you're sitting into the skin of the building. And then even at the front entry of the building, to take that cedar surface and extend it out into a kind of hand that brings you into the project. Another project that we were working almost exclusively with contouring or shaping the ceiling was in an existing McKim, White building. This is at Columbia University. Again, a kind of mechanical system problem. We couldn't change much in the mechanical systems, and it was a lecture hall, so we had to figure out a way we could bring a kind of coherence to all that stuff while making sure that McKim, White's windows were visible. All of this stuff, of course, was added long after the building had originally been opened. It basically was a problem. So how could we kind of combine all this stuff together, and through the development of the ceiling's surface, could we get a kind of both a performance and an aesthetic alignment that was appropriate? We work with coffers, and the idea that these coffers could engage lighting or mechanical diffusers, but would also go from kind of innies to outies. So we would get this continuous surface that down here, that's actually a very large projector that becomes encased in the ceiling. But you still get the visibility of the large-scale McKim, White buildings, windows of the existing building on the sides. Okay, so Shear argues that one would keep the amount of surface area of a floor, but by either displacing each floor on top of each other slightly to the side, a kind of horizontal shear, you can open up the space, or you could look at it being a vertical shear, and I'll explain that a little later. So the horizontal shear is often used for housing projects. It's a way of basically raking a building to allow it to open up to the sky. So here in Sauvage's apartment buildings in Paris, there's a horizontal shear. Each floor is kind of displaced off to the side. It opens up to the sun, and the downside to the horizontal shear is it means the other side is more in shadow. It's the kind of underbelly. And what Sauvage did, which was really smart, is he took these two horizontal shears, placed them back to back, and then in that darker underbelly located a swimming pool. So it's a kind of ingenious way of taking advantage of that problem. Big and JDS, or Plot Architects in Copenhagen, had a more extreme rake to their diagram of the horizontal shear. In this case, they were basically cladding an apartment building on top of an existing parking garage, or at least programmatically it was an existing parking garage. So the rake is much more extreme, and as a result, you get a lot more garden terraces, but you also get a lot more underbelly, and that was okay because they had a parking garage that they had to cover. So another model of the horizontal shear is when you place it on top of itself. And here in Weissman Frady's center at Barnard, in effect, it's a horizontal shear that has a ceiling that's equivalently horizontally sheared, and it produces a series of double height spaces so that you can stand deep into the footprint and be able to look all the way out at the lawn of the college. The vertical shear is slightly different. It argues that by displacing a floor halfway up, and you can think about split-level houses are a good example of this, it provides a kind of continuity and legibility and movement, whether it's visual or physical, or even movement of air from side to side. So you're not actually passing through a floor, you're kind of passing from floor to floor. And it means that the area here in Hertzberger's school becomes a kind of social center, but the spaces that are a little bit further away are more private. So it's able to negotiate a kind of social collective and the private zone simultaneously. And then Diller, Scafidio, and Renfro's Brown Center for the Creative Arts, that vertical shear is registered with two glass lines. And in effect, what this is doing is intensifying the cross-pollination between different performing arts. So being able to be in a particular kind of concert hall or a dance venue and be able to kind of look and see what's going on in the adjacent floors. So the vertical shear is incredibly good at intensifying exchanges through the section. And in both of these models, you don't lose any square footage, right? You're simply enacting different section connections through that surface. Now, in a much smaller project, we've worked with a vertical shear in an apartment project, an apartment building, where we embedded the stair at the gap between two stairs, between two apartments that were joined and they, of course, misaligned. But the stair became the way of negotiating not only between those different levels, but also kind of positioning different kind of more quiet spaces related to the larger living area. And then looking at how that stair would start to move between these different floors. Okay, so hole is, and you're probably all thinking, what is hole? It is as dumb as it sounds. It is a hole. It's a hole in a floor plate. So, and this is a super common way that architects make section qualities in a building. Unlike the last two models I was talking about where you don't lose square footage, obviously with a hole you lose a certain amount of square footage. So that often has to be justified. It's often justified for utilitarian purposes, elevators, mechanical shafts, etc. But it can also have qualities, architectural qualities. So what do I mean by that? A double height space in Corbusier's house basically organizes the hierarchy between a social area and a kind of more private living area. It allows light to come in. It involves the loss of that square footage, but the benefits outweigh that loss. Much larger holes become atriums, and Larkin building is largely organized around this interior space. It is the premise upon which the rest of the building is hinged, even to the point that the exterior, which was quite polluted in Buffalo at the time, is ignored because you're looking inward at this large atrium. And another atrium that essentially pulls away from the city somewhat is the Ford Foundation, introducing this kind of green oasis in the middle of 42nd Street. And then you see a little bit of horizontal shear here. That's because the green garden is able to then migrate up that surface, right? Great example of the way in which a hole has now become so big, it becomes almost a city unto itself. And Portman, of course, Portman hotels are basically an extreme version. When the hole becomes so big, it becomes a spectacle. It becomes that city displaced or removed from the other city that it's existing in. Holes can also operate in multiple, and one of the most fascinating version is Ito's MediaTek, where the hole was combined with a column, and so you got these morcellated or these mesh columns that were actually holes that would then connect from floor to floor mechanically, circulation, etc. A kind of ingenious combination of two contradictory things, a hole and a column. So really, really fascinating project. We've worked with the idea of opening up a space quite a bit for a number of different reasons. This is a dormitory we did for a university for the deaf, where sight lines for sign language are super important. So to be a communicating stair, you actually have to have enough room around it to communicate. So by positioning the stair within a much larger space, within a much larger hole, we were able to allow the stair to become capable of facilitating conversations while you're on the stair and for people adjacent to that stair. So lounges would kind of unfold and be connected to this stair. And it became a kind of central heart, even though it was the absence of a certain amount of floor area. The ground floor of this building was very different. It really took on a kind of the issue of the shape section. We wanted to have these different areas where people could have more private conversations, smaller gathering areas. But the sight lines were really important so that when there was large gathering, everyone could be able to see within the architectural space. Okay. So in a project close by that was very dear to our heart, we worked on this project from about 2005 for the next 8 or 9 years. And it was an existing building in the heart of Austin, corner of Congress and 7th. Fascinating history. Started out as a theater with a proscenium stage. In the 1950s, it was turned into a department store, so essentially got two extruded sections placed inside of it. And so in a sense, we'd inherited a building that had these two different structural systems. And our question was, how can we, given some of the constraints of the existing building, both recognize that it's this layered history that is its history, so we needed to find a way to add to it while also reflecting the kind of laminations of the surfaces and histories and structures that were embedded in the building. Not surprisingly, a lot of our design occurred through removal, and the stair became a kind of key component to that design. So here the stair was actually a way of kind of getting you up into the project. And for us, it was an opportunity to not do simply a kind of utilitarian stair that would connect from the lower ground floor up to the main gallery floor, but it needed to have something that really engaged the depth of the section. So we thought about it as both being suspended from the very roof deck of the building, as well as being very heavy and grounded into the concrete of the existing floor. And so in a sense, these treads would extend from the roof deck down and allow you to have that moment on the fourth tread where you would go from kind of two different notions of structure and gravity. This was all something that we kind of tested out in section, and one of the important things was we were trying to find a way that the hole that would be cut in the floor would be basically a square, a rectangular geometry, but by inclining the tread both in both axes, according to the dimension of the nosing of a tread, we would end up getting a much more seductive space. And what I mean, so this in a sense, that nosing slope generated the overall geometry of these entire planks. Each tread and structural extension were one piece. It caused a lot of stress on the part of the contractor putting this thing in. It allowed us to develop a space that went from being about 5 feet wide down here that opened up to about 8 feet wide at the second level. So simply by configuring the detail of a nosing with the kind of geometry of a rectangular hole, we got this much more seductive and evocative space. And here you see the way in which that, in a sense, you kind of feel like you're being brought up into the project. Again, this kind of notion of a hand dropping down to gather you and bring you into the upper level. The project, as some of you might know, involved a combination of Art House and the Austin Museum of Art and became the Contemporary. And so we had the unique opportunity, and we really enjoyed the fact that we could go back and rethink the building given the kind of new desires on the part of the Contemporary. One of which was to figure out a way to get larger scale crates from the ground floor up to the second level. And so we found this to be an interesting question, like could we actually introduce a way to move those crates without losing square footage on the floor, again, by introducing a hole. So this was a way of kind of burying a mechanical system that would then basically disappear, and this is my favorite moment. You just drop the lid and the floor plate's back, so you don't lose any square footage, but you're able to activate it when needed for the purposes of the crates. The main gallery space had a similar logic. We knew we'd have to reinforce the structure of the existing trusses by adding new steel to be able to make it an occupiable roof deck. That gave us an opportunity to imagine those trusses as tracks for gantries, and so we could design a wall that could be moved relatively quickly to reconfigure the space. This wall is, I think, largely kind of locked into this position now, but it has the capacity to be released. And the roof deck, which was designed really as this inhabitable piece of furniture, when we were asked to come back and rethink the building, it was a fantastic space, but it got fantastically hot in the Austin sun. And so our question was to figure out a way that we could displace a kind of extruded section high enough up that it would feel that you were neither inside or outside. It would be too high to feel like you were in interior, but still produce the sun shading and the rain protection necessary to be in a kind of quasi-indoor. So here you see the roof canopy with its knife edge, Jim Hodges' sign, the art with liberty and justice for all, which really is a kind of fantastic facade for the building. It's provided a very different kind of sense of identity, and we think the roof canopy works very well to kind of frame that. These are quite high letters, and yet the roof is placed even higher to allow even more breathing room around the art. For weather enclosure, we looked at ways that we could pull drapes around these sails that would allow you to transform the space and provide a kind of protection relative to weather. And in a sense, take this space that has the capacity to link back out to the city, but to provide a kind of gossamer interior. Again, here, one of the nicest moments in this building is when there are events, and it really feels as though these events in the city start to merge into each other due to the section height of the roof. Okay, so the second to last section type is incline. And again, these are not complicated section types. The important thing is they're different. And with incline, the argument was that through ramps or through inclines, that you could move a plan from one level into the other. Basically, take plan and ooze it through section to get to the other. What this means is you get continuity, but that continuity comes with a sacrifice. So in Villa Savoye, you get 3 feet of continuity, but get 33 feet of discontinuity, right? So this is always the trade-off of the ramp. And when Frank Lloyd Wright did the Guggenheim, he realized that the way to absolve that discontinuity in this continuous ramping surface is to basically place a hole in the middle of it. That now the discontinuity becomes a visual seduction. You're able to look across the discontinuity, and the discontinuity kind of disappears. Koolhaas in the Kunsthal in Rotterdam took the totally opposite direction and said rather than absolving or getting rid of the discontinuity, he's going to intensify it. So in fact, the entire project, the entire Kunsthal to us is a continuously unfolding surface of the gallery, but it intensifies the contradiction between different programs, whether it's an auditorium and a store, a passage of the public through the heart of the building versus circulating up to the galleries. It's the intensification of that discontinuity. So we were very interested in how this might work in a project called Park Tower, the argument being that you could have a drive-up skyscraper. So how would you develop a kind of drive-up skyscraper where you could have close parking of all cars to program, and that in the act of going from those parking spaces, you could, in a sense, activate a social space. So here there's a store level where you get that exchange between those, or in the hotel level where we would get a motel on the upper level wrapping around an atrium, producing a spectacle hotel in the middle. And some details, we like the idea that you could dive off of the parking garage into a swimming pool. And then the residential neighborhood, a kind of vertically organized kind of neighborhood where you would park on the top of your apartment and then descend down in. So the last section type is nest, and where the other models are all based on flat plates, and I should say that all of these section types are based on 20th century construction types. So Chicago frame, repetitive steel floors, et cetera, non-load bearing systems generally. Nest makes the argument that rather than just dealing with flat plates, you would deal with volumes. And what can architects do if they work with volumes as the unit? So a couple of examples, Sue Fujimoto in his house said, all right, what happens if I not only produce the volume that separates interior and exterior, but inside that I place another volume that negotiates between different programs, and on the property edge, I'm going to build another volume, and the project's going to be entirely about the kind of Russian doll characteristic of how these would merge into each other. Really kind of interesting project. Charles Moore has looked at ways that he can embed rooms within a tiny project by introducing these kind of more celebratory moments with skylights, whether it's a kind of bathing area or a dining room. So again, kind of nesting volumes within volumes. Prada by Herzog and de Meuron uses these nested volumes for structural stiffening, but also a place to position changing rooms and support facilities. And the Beinecke Library is a really good example of how the nested section is able to allow you to have a kind of thermal control for, say, rare books that are then placed within the alabaster skin. And of course, this object is now made possible because of the stacked section, all the stuff that exists below grade. The thermal performance of the nested section is really crucial, and the Mont-Cenis Training Center is really an argument that says these are your comfort areas, and that by placing a passive solar glass and wood box around it, you're able to get a kind of interstitial space between the outside and the comfort interior that might be kind of quasi-inside, quasi-outside, and it really changes the whole reading of what constitutes the architectural skin. So with a project, Born Heater Hall, we were looking at ways that the study nooks could be cantilevered into this social space that was actually an outside room. So that in the act of simply studying within the hallway, you could actually be in a kind of theater box looking back out to the comings and going. The daily life of the dormitory becomes connected to the more kind of private moment of studying. And then being able to kind of look across from unit to unit. And in a project that a competition we won in Telluride for an art center, this project was set up for a nested section. We had to deal with an existing stone wall, one of the older building artifacts in Telluride. How do we work with this and deal with kind of thermal controls, humidity controls? It meant that we really had to imagine that the project was going to be a volume within a volume, and that would allow us to work with the historic shell, put it on display, make it visible, but to still be able to have a conditioned volume inside of it that would allow us to have this kind of gradient of control. So we'd have temperature control, but then we'd have temperature and humidity for the art on the inside. And then that really became the diagram of the project. So we went from the stone walls to a concrete foundation, placing inside the stone walls a kind of a mass timber figure of CLT, and then the glass interstitial layout negotiating between those. So from the outside, the project's almost invisible, just glimpses of the wood that you see up here, and it becomes visible when you walk into that interstitial space, and how that would open up depending on the weather and the quality of the temperature. In good weather, you really could get this porous exchange, and throughout the whole building, the building is on display to itself. The historic wall is instrumental in the reading of the building itself, and that's registered then in the stairwell that goes all the way up this space, that you're able to touch the wood on one side and the stone on the other. And that works its way up to the second level, which again is a kind of gallery space caught between those surfaces, and then activates it through a series of windows. So we like the idea that you could sit down into the floor and look out, so we get this alignment with some of the historic windows. And then even in the elevator, that there'd be a window in the elevator moving between these and allowing you to see the space between these two volumes, nested volumes. The rooftop was the key space because of the phenomenal views in Telluride that you would get at the top of the wood figure. Now, to make sure that this point of the kind of nested section was hammered home, we built the model in a crate that we would then kind of cart and pack that diagram the project. Even from the very moment of unveiling the project, we were trying to make an argument about its section. All right, so the last project I'll show is Poster House, which just opened this summer in New York. It's a through block space. It's the first museum dedicated to the art of the poster in New York, and I think in the United States. And the space was great, except it had a couple of problems, not the least of which is as a through block, it was 220 feet long, and it had a set of these kind of amazing cast iron columns that ran dead center through the middle of the project. It was a porous building, so humidity control became a key issue. So one of our struggles was to say, all right, how do you actually place a gallery within this, and how do you activate that? How do you take advantage of that super long space? So really the argument was to say, okay, we're going to place a volume within the volume, a gallery nested within the overall space, and that the space outside of it would be treated as a kind of street. So in a sense, we would get the ability to have this movement that would move through from 23rd to 24th Street that would really enact a kind of street-like experience, which of course is the natural environment that posters exist in. So the street would be the place to display posters, as well as the more controlled area in the gallery proper that would have the humidity controls. And then that transition down the length of the space we felt was really important. So at any moment down this promenade, this section would read differently. And at the intersection of two lines that we kind of, in this bow tie diagram, would be the entry into the main gallery door. On the other side would be located a very long piece of furniture. That would be the cafe, the bookstore, the seating area, the stair to the lower level. That would be thought of really as one large inhabited piece of millwork. It was produce all kinds of problems. But it was an interesting challenge to develop it. 24th Street is about 2 feet higher than 23rd Street. Millwork doesn't like negotiating variations in floor. So, so this is a kind of sequence of cross sections, or should be a sequence of cross sections to give a sense of how we're anticipating the building almost kind of bringing you into the gallery, and then you would continue to go up to 23rd Street. View from the outside, and a sense of that dividing line between the clay kind of stucco, the concrete floor, and then the original wood floor, and how that registers the space as you work your way down. The front entry into the main gallery, and then turning around, looking back out at the street. That section, at any moment walking down the section, is varying, which we thought was super important. So inside the gallery, even that division between the clay and the drywall of the gallery is registered at the column line, and we were really interested in how the columns would. By actually hiding the columns, we'd actually be able to put them on better display. That we'd actually make a space for the column capital, illuminate them with the LED lights, and still be able to, in a sense, get old and new to work in a collective dialogue. So, some details of the handrail going down. And finally, the green screen room, which was at one of the windows, the storefront windows, was an ability to allow you to embed yourself in posters. And we liked the fact that there was a way to map that into the architecture. And it was also a way that I get to, I should say that my son, my children have been dragged to so many cities to look at buildings that my son has emphatically stated that next time he wants to go to a city that has no buildings. So it made sense to allow him to inhabit the poster where he's destroying a city as the attack of the 50-foot woman. Okay. Very quickly, hybrids are, for us, where most architecture pleasure takes place. So being able to look at the Rolex Learning Center and say, look, it's an extruded stacked section that's been shaped and now perforated with holes, and as a result relates to those issues. Or a series of stacked sections that are placed on top of each other. A series of stacked shaped sections that are placed on top of each other, or a series of shaped sections that are arrayed around the hole and stacked. Or the architectural petting zoo, the section petting zoo, which is the Seattle Public Library, an amazing building, which is basically an inventive combination of all kinds of different section types. Want to just very quickly state that the way we get to these drawings is we thought of as a kind of visual scholarship, that could we actually go into not just kind of what's available online, but actually meet with architects who worked on the project, get access to the working drawings. This is Buckminster Fuller's partner. To be able to work at a very detailed level, developing a Rhino model, figuring out where we would cut a section through that Rhino model, then developing two-dimensional drawings. We were also very interested in what took place inside the building as well as the context around the building. Staging the exact view that would enact the perspective's relationship to the section. We found it very weird that we were redlining Buckminster Fuller projects, but it was a way of kind of connecting these all together. Each of these drawings took about 150 hours, and a lot of people worked on it, and everyone was paid. We had no unpaid interns on this. We lost a fortune, but it didn't matter. It was all in the greater good of architecture and the pleasure of section. At our opening, our kids did not want to attend the opening of the book, and we figured out a way that we'd print out the drawings, they could actually color them in. The Sauvage's Blue Period, or my daughter's version of Psychedelic Herzog and de Meuron. I'm very proud of that one. And the idea of starting to kind of get kids to think about section at a young age seems to be the right thing to do. So we ended up making a coloring book to make it possible for even young children to involve themselves in the role of section. It shouldn't come after the fact, it should be generative. So it's been a real pleasure to be here, and thank you very much.